welcome to this presentation. Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different than usual. We're going to go a little bit more in depth in early Taurian battle mech development. The Taurians are our galactic neighbors here in the Oregon Trade Alliance, so we kind of enjoy their presence even though we've had a few run-in with them over the years. And it is one of the oldest periphery nations, and even one of the older nations here in greater human-controlled space that we know of. They are also people who had a lot of hardship pushed onto them. So it's an interesting group of people to talk about, and an interesting military history. So let's get into it. As stated, the Taurian Concordat is really one of the earliest major periphery state, and it was founded in 2335 by Richard Calderon, but it technically comes from one of his ancestors, Samantha Calderon, who was fleeing persecution and, assassination attempts by the Terran Alliance government around 2250. The Terran Alliance is what would later become the Terran hegemony and later on the center of the Star League, but the Terran Alliance had a lot of issues in that particular time frame and were really not the nicest people around. The Taurians, however, are extremely nationalistic and quite individualistic, which is a little bit weird when we look at our modern day neo-feudalism that encompasses most of at least inner sphere space. A lot of people do take them for crazy space libertarians, but really, if you start digging into it, the Taurians are much closer to some of the more militaristic states which you had in history of mankind, with obligatory military service, well, at least civil service, being imposed upon people, and with very strong industrial base and support for its industries. The Taurians were also quite opposed to being a part of the inner sphere, compared to some of the other nations which were okay to be identified as members of the inner sphere. The Taurians really wanted nothing to do with it. They refused to sign the Ares Convention when it was put out, which caused a little bit of a kerfuffle with Aus Liao. And when the Reunification War went into full gear, they were one of the primary antagonists to the Star League due to how Star League was trying to impose their will upon a nation which wanted nothing to do with it. The Taurians were also one of the major spark which would kill the Star League in the end, even though they were not directly related to the Amorance regime. They were one of the major reasons why the Star League military was completely caught unaware from the Rimworld Republic coup attempt, basically. Now, if we go a little bit more on the military side, some people might be wondering why the Taurian, the Canopian, the Republicans even, and the Awarians didn't really have any of the fancy gadgets the Inner Sphere had, not only in terms of military, but also in terms of regular advanced technology. One thing you have to know is that the Terran hegemony had what a lot of people called the Cameron Blacklist, which is a thing that basically was around until the formation of the Star League. The idea was that technology needed to be kept close to home, and that anything that was, fancier than a spork couldn't really leave the hegemony without a full review and a full backing. So things like battle mech technology, well, that wasn't going to be something that was going to be shared. And even things like water purification designs or more advanced jump drives, anything like that would not be allowed outside of hegemony space. The idea of mechs, of course, was something that was around for a while, with industrial mechs being here and there, but it really took until the end of the 25th century and the onset of the 26th century for most periphery state to have at least a basic understanding of battle mech and a basic understanding of what kind of weapon systems could be used on those walking machines. Effectively, the first battle mechs the Taurian got was actually Aus Liao's weapon-armed Mech Alpha, which is not a thing that we talk about a whole lot, even in battle mech history, because it was really just a prototype. The most common one, or the one most people really talk about, is the weapon-armed mech Beta, or Bravo, which ended up being renamed the Firebee, and has been in production more recently as well, even though it had a long stoppage in production. The Capellan and the Taurians really didn't like each other, but the Taurians had a lot of spies and a lot of really nice people infiltrated into the Confederation. So salvaging equipment, stealing equipment, and regular defections, as some people didn't really want to work or serve in the Capellan military, basically served into bringing a lot of those weapon-armed mech alpha to the Taurian Concordat. Really, we don't have a whole lot of specs on that WAM-A. What we know is that it was repurposed really quickly to that WAM-B. It was meant to be using a lot of missiles because they were reliable weapons. It had a terrible leg assembly that barely worked and had issues trying to keep up with other test vehicles. So the entire details on the machine we have are mostly like it was a WAM-B that was 30 tons and a few different things in terms of the body kit. What we know, though, is that the Taurians got their hands on quite a few of them, and it's what led them to develop more battle mechs in the long run. It is really true industrial espionage that the Taurians managed to figure out what they needed to do in order to build a battle mech. A lot of it came from Aus Liao with those WAM-A, but also part of it came from Aus Davion, who had a decent step in developing new battle mechs, even as the Camerons didn't really want them to. When they got those WAM-As, they dissected them and figured out how they worked and what made them tick, and it's what led to the development of the TRA-1 Toro in 2481. At 35 tons, it was the same weight as that WAM-B, and not that WAM-A. It was slower than the design the Capellans were going with that what would become the Firebee, with a top speed of about 65 kilometers per hour, but it was heavily armored compared to it with 10.5 tons of the primitive armor, which gives you a coverage of about 66% compared to what we currently use for standard armor. As far as weaponry goes, that A1 used a large laser and two 2-tube SRMs with 1 ton of shared ammo. I mean, it gives you a decent number of shots since you get about 100 missiles per ton of SRMs. Unlike that WAM-A, which was purely a missile device, this one could run longer engagement. It could be used for extended period of time. Didn't have the same range. It didn't have an LRM, but a large laser still gives you a very good medium range punch, let's say. And even though it couldn't outrun those WAM-Bs, once the WAM-B got into shooting range with all of its SRM, well, you could usually outmatch it with that large laser. You had 10 heat sinks, which was more than enough to keep the Toro cool as well. There's an A2 to an A5 that exists as well in very limited production runs, where you start replacing one piece of primitive hardware with another, starting with the armor, the engine, the cockpit, the gyro assembly. All sorts of things get swapped out as more modern parts start being available. Your true real final production version was the TRA-6 Toro, which really served admirably all the way till the end of the Reunification War. It was equipped with a Taurus Warwork PPC rather than a large laser. You do get a minimum range on that PPC, which makes it a little bit less effective at short range than that large laser. And you add 2 Delta Dart 5-rack LRMs on the shoulders, which were pretty fine, but once again, they have minimum range, so if something really got close to your Toro, not going to be as efficient as you might sometimes want it to. It would be serving as a very nice mobile support platform, and by the time the A6 came out, other mechs started being in the service of the Taurian state, which could be used as close combat units. You had a decent top speed at 85 kilometers per hour, and you had 6.5 tons of the good armor, which is pretty much as you would want on a mech that size. It did run a little bit odd because that PPC does take up those 10 heat sinks if you start shooting it. So you do have to be a little bit more careful with your heat management than you would on that A1 model. The Toro was what was decided to be produced en masse, but there were other ideas floating around at the time wanting heavier designs. What really came through, though, was for heavier designs, the Taurians would be using what House Davion had been building, thanks to, once again, industrial espionage, defections, and salvaging. The two main mechs that they would be using would be the Battle Axe and the Amorance. This would give them an understanding of the heavy category of battle mechs, but they never really produced any in this early era. What they really did was grab them when they were available and made them their own. Those two mechs, the Battle Axe and the Amorance, are the ancestor of our more commonly seen Warhammer. The Battle Axe was 70 ton, the Amorance was 75 tons, and both of them follow the philosophy of two big guns, with the Battle Axe having either two large lasers or two PPCs, depending on if it's the early model or the later model, and the Amorance using a pair of AC-10s. You also have backup weapons on those, generally medium lasers, some missiles on the Battle Axe. Those mechs were also known to have jump jets, which the Davion pilots didn't really like, but gave an understanding, once again, of jump jets to the Taurian Concordat. While they did not mass produce these designs, they were being built with spare parts as well to make sure the existing ones that they were acquiring were kept running fairly well. Assault mechs in the periphery at that time were extremely rare as well. What you really saw in the Taurian Concordat and around there were mainly Mackie clones that had been built by the Davion, by House Yao, by House Merrick, and had been propagated through various means. You did see other hegemony designs float around as well, those 1E Banshees, which were not terrible machines in the long run, and some of those 1A Emperors, which are not that good, if you ask me. But those were never really easy to appropriate. You got one, you kept it, and you tried to keep it in really good working order. One of the only machines they were really able to buy was the LGB-0C longbow, because StarCorp had very little qualms and even less morals, and they were very glad to just sell everything they were building to anybody with enough money to buy them. So even non-inner sphere powers could acquire longbows that fell off the back of dropships. At the start of the 26th century, more and more people were wanting to get into the battle mech game, and some were less scrupulous than others. Concordat Telecom and Transstellar basically sold telephony products and radio products to people, but they really wanted a piece of that pie and the money that came with it. They didn't really have the knowledge or the military in order to do so, even though they were a Concordat corporation, but they were fairly resourceful. What they did was grab farm equipment, basically industrial mech built for farming and construction work, and started tinkering with it in order to build a battle mech at 45 ton called the Quasit. QUA-51T was the original production model there. Most military commanders would be able to make the difference, but periphery militias or even commanders that had limited understanding of battle mechs would not really see much of a difference between the two. What really makes the Quasit not a battle mech is its internal structure, which is built of pig iron pistons and basic Myomer bundles, which are nowhere near the military standard. And it's about double the weight of a regular battle mech internal structure. Another thing that is needed on these kinds of machines would be a full environmental sealing to prevent it from getting hit by things like, tear gas and toxic weaponry. So in order to get that, well, you need another 4.5 tons about to seal the whole thing up. which means the design loses about 9 tons compared to a standard battle mech design. Outside of that, though, if you start looking at the Quasit, it's good enough. That's what you could say that machine is. And for the price, it's good enough. Once again, it goes 85 kilometers per hour, which is good enough for a medium. It's armored with 7.5 tons of the good enough industrial armor. It's about as good as standard battle mech armor, and you could pretty much replace it 1-for-1 if you're fighting out there. And it's got the good enough control system with a good enough targeting computer, even though it's not military standard. The only thing that's not in that ad assembly is an ejection seat. For weaponry, you get a medium laser on the right arm, a 4-tube SRM on the left arm, a machine gun to serve against infantry in the torso, and a 5-rack LRM in the center torso. Weapons spread out throughout the entire design, meaning that if you lose a part, you're still going to be able to fight. The design itself is, once again, good enough. You just don't have the kind of firepower you would normally get on a 45-ton mech, just because you're sacrificing a chunk of your internals in order to pretend to be a battle mech. The last new model we're going to talk about today is Vandenberg Miltech's Talos, or I've heard it spelled all sorts of different ways. It is probably the most advanced design the Taurians came out with before the Reunification War, and it was one that they sold to just about everybody. One of its biggest advantages was that it was extremely easy to pilot and extremely easy to train on, and it was also fairly rugged. At 50 tons, it was in that medium range, and it used very standard parts for just about everything. The engine was a Nissan 200, which is still an engine that is used in massive amounts of mechs, and it could go up to 65 kilometers per hour, which is decent enough for a medium mech, not super fast, but it has 8.5 tons of armor, and it's cooled by 10 EATs, which is more than enough for its weapon load. You get an AC-10 from Western Heavy with 2 tons of ammo, which is actually better than the Enforcer, and is the same as the Centurion, both other gunslinger mechs. And to back that up, you got a 5-rack LRM for long-range engagement. You actually get 2 of those on one of the shoulder, and the other shoulder as a 6-tube SRM for when things get close and personal. You have no energy weapons, which I sometimes decry. I mean, this thing needs to stay close to supply lines. It needs to be kept protected from ammo explosion, but you won't overeat too much with that kind of weaponry. And, of course, as with most mechs in the periphery, you're going to see about 7,000 different side designs of it built by individual people. There were no official secondary designs of the Talos, but it is stayed in production long enough for everybody to have a few of them, and you won't see a whole lot of them nowadays, as production ended a long time ago, and those machines were kept on the front line and suffered fairly heavy losses. As the Taurians were one of the most active participants in the Star League War of Aggression, their losses were really, really large during that period, and the Star League imposed a lot of restrictions on them afterwards. The Taurians lost about 20% of their population during the Reunification War, which is a catastrophic amount of deaths if you calculate in the long run. The idea was they wanted the Taurian will to be broken after that by dismantling most of their industry, making sure they weren't able to produce any weapons, and it didn't really work. The Taurians got madder with the whole situation rather than feeling down and letting the oppressor take over. The losses and the damage that was done during the Reunification War, though, could be felt all the way to the mid-31st century if you look not only at the industry but at the population, and that damage that was done on various cities, various infrastructure, farmland. This whole situation often gets painted as a great thing to have happened, and peace and freedom being brought to the periphery by the Star League. until you start actually looking at what the periphery actually suffered during that era. One of the main things the Star League did was to make sure that the production of the Toro would be shut down after they vassalized Taurians. But to be honest, with the sheer amount of Toros that were built, and the fact that none of them were built with components that were fairly rare, we kept seeing Toros pop up in the periphery ever since. There was also a few local facilities which built newish models, basically repurposing parts that they were able to get throughout most of the Succession War. You probably even had actual factories producing mostly new Toros during that period that had been kept in from the Star League, thanks to the Stefan Amaris Screw the Star League Fund, which was fully being used by the Taurians right before the Star League Civil War. If you ever see a Toros, always look at the serial number on the various parts, just to laugh at the discrepancies that some of them say, with some of them saying that they were built before the Toros was actually in production. And I've even seen some future dated, basically, to the 32nd century, when the machine was very, very likely built in the middle of the 31st century. Very funny thing that happens when you look at various Toros that have been running around. There has been a revival of the Toros, with the Taurians having full military production nowadays. They started building brand new models in 3108 with the TR-B9. It's a modern design using ferrofibrous armor and case to protect the ammo, which is pretty useful. And the pilot is squeezed into a small cockpit. The original Toros was just a very cramped and very uncomfortable cockpit, so you at least save some weight here. In order to protect you against various electronic warfare equipment, you do get a Guardian ECM. For weapons, it's a little bit different from your original Toros, with a light PPC and a medium laser in the arm assembly, and your shoulders carry multi-missile launchers, 5 tubes, with a ton of LRM and a ton of SRM, most of the time. So you get a far more polyvalent mech, with the ability to fight in short range, at long range, but you lose that kind of punch you were getting from that one big gun. I don't think it's a bad design. It keeps the mentality of the Toros going, and it has just enough new protection on it with that Guardian ECM and those cases to keep them running for a long time. After that, of course, someone had to make it stupid. Really, the Toros is meant to be a cheap line combat mech at 35 ton. It's not meant to be one of those super advanced, super modern weapon that's supposed to do everything and ends up being stupidly expensive. But that's what they actually did with the B12. And everybody at FRR, when we heard about it, we just stopped working for a second, sighed, and kept working on the original Toros. It does go 96 kilometers per hour, so it's a little bit faster, and it uses an XL engine, so the price goes up, and it's far more fragile because of it. You get an endo steel chassis, which is harder to procure and harder to maintain standard chassis, which is not a terrible thing. Most people now have endo steel mills available to them, but it does use double heat sinks, which is a nice improvement, and it does fit fairly well in that larger engine. To improve protection, at least you get a pair of Case 2 to protect the ammo, which is a very nice improvement. And the medium laser is replaced with an ER medium laser, giving you a bit more range. And the light PPC is also linked to a targeting computer, so you get more accuracy on those two direct fire weapon. Your ECM, rather than a Guardian, is replaced with an Angel, which is more powerful, has a better range. I do enjoy that. It's a bit heavier, but you add the room in this particular case. It's more expensive, it's more fragile, it's harder to build. It's the complete opposite of what a Toros really should be. Nowadays, the Taurian Concordat and their offshoot, the Calderon Protectorate, are some of the most industrious battle mech producer out there in all weight class, all categories. There's plenty of factories, there's plenty of parts locations, and they do export a decent amount of it to just about anyone who's able to pay for it. The Concordat and the Protectorate are about to merge again once the the two heirs come of age, basically. And I'm at this point starting to believe that they will be growing stronger and stronger and probably rival some of the minor inner sphere states that have been popping up. It will really depend on if they do want to play ball with the new Star League or if the new Star League sticks around. It'll be really a case of will they, won't they, once that time comes. Even as someone who is originally from the sphere, I really love to appreciate the periphery and the people living in the periphery, and especially all the weird things that happen to them that we're not always very well informed of as resident of the sphere or of the Star League or what remained of it. And I understand a lot of their views on foreign powers and wanting to fight against them. So I hope you guys have a very nice rest of your day. I thank you very much for listening to me for so long, and I will see you guys later. Bye-bye.